2010, a busy year of memorable worldwide events. At home, Prince William gets engaged.
He's a true romantic.
The Conservative Party unites with the Liberal Democrats to form a coalition government. Apple released the first generation of the iPad, heralding a new dawn in technology.
Three lions torn apart by the Germans.
At the World Cup, Germany sent England home.
Lampard's disallowed goal added to the...
But in Russia, a darker, deadly atmosphere pervades.
I have no doubt that this was an attempt to kill.
Journalists, businessmen, human rights activists are found shot, strangled, poisoned, murdered.
Quite a few of Putin's enemies have perished by swallowing things they shouldn't have.
The killings weren't limited to Moscow.
The death of a jogger in this exclusive Surrey neighbourhood is officially unexplained.
The Secret Intelligence Service was awakening to a new era of Cold War espionage. In 2006, the murder of Litvinenko in London confirmed there were no borders or barriers to the Kremlin's dark arts.
I cannot think of another capital globally that really represents the centre of espionage more than London itself. And that was an interesting experience being an MI6 officer, because I would deploy as much trade craft simply going across London as I would do in any other city in the world.
The world of espionage had entered its most dangerous phase since the Cold War, and London was the battleground. This was the deadly environment that Gareth was promoted to in 2010. Just months later, he was dead. But who was the spy in the bag?
Gareth Williams was a highly talented mathematician. I think it's probably fair to call him a genius.
Gareth Williams was regarded as highly proficient and a very effective member of the security organisation for which he worked. He was based normally at GCHQ in Cheltenham, but was on short-term transfer to MI6.
MI6 is the elite institution of the British Intelligence Service, and it's always looking to recruit the best minds in the country. Gareth passed his GCSEs aged 10, A-levels by 13, and his first degree by 17. His extraordinary mind was evident from a very early age.
I've never come across anybody who had that ability at all. He was way above anything that I've ever seen. We had people who went to Oxford and Cambridge, but this was something totally different. He was way above anything I couldn't imagine, to be quite honest. He wasn't a social child, if you understand what I mean. He was definitely happier when he was sitting in front of a computer, there's no doubt about it. He was just totally on his own, and the computer was his friend. It's that simple.
The beating heart of GCHQ are its mathematicians. They are the code breakers, the direct descendants of the people who shortened the Second World War by a number of years by breaking German codes in Bletchley Park.
So how did this brilliant 31-year-old MI6 operative meet such a chilling end? One day in August 2010, the police received a call from the Government Communications Headquarters, the hub of the UK Intelligence Service, better known as GCHQ. It was a phone call that would lead to one of Britain's biggest unsolved mysteries.
Emergency service. I wanted to report one of our members of staff who lives and works in London as missing.
Detective Sergeant Paul Colgan was first to respond.
There was certainly nothing within the message to suggest that this was anything more than a knock on the door to see who was there, if they were okay, and then report back. It was in a quiet residential road, an old Victorian building.
This revealing footage gave an insight into Gareth's lifestyle and the contents of his flat.
Going into the flat, it was immaculate. There wasn't a thing out of place. I remember there were laptops, certainly computers in there. A couple of mobile phones I do remember being on the table. There was a number of North Face bags piled up. and I remember there was a couple of wigs on the side. The bedroom again was tidy. There was certainly nothing to suggest there had been a struggle or any form of crime had taken place at that point. On walking into the bathroom, nothing to suggest anything had happened. The only strange thing was the bag in the bath. It was secured with a padlock through 2 zippers meeting in the middle. When I picked it up, it was heavy, but not inordinately heavy in that I could lift it myself without help from anybody else. But because of the odour that was coming from it and the fluid that was leaking from it, I decided that it had to be cut open. I decided to cut down the side of it near the zipper, but not on the padlock itself, in order to preserve as much forensics as possible. On cutting through the bag, I was met by an overpowering stench of decomposing flesh. It's something you never forget. The first thing I saw was a nose, then opened the bag a little bit further, and then there was the face of a body, had clearly been dead for some time, frothing at the mouth and nose. That was the point I decided that this was a crime scene, and we would leave the premises, secure them, and then call in the murder teams to take over.
There's been a huge amount of police activity and people in forensic outfits, all a bit grim, really.
Good gracious me, how a man can be obviously murdered in his flat there is awful. That doesn't normally happen.
Now being treated as a suspicious death, forensics teams were called to the flat to start looking for any potential evidence.
I think, obviously, that you always feel very saddened by the scene in front of you. You can't help that. I think you wouldn't be human if you didn't. But the great thing that I've found is that you become so overwhelmed almost immediately with the need to start doing something really meaningful. And it's really important that you get going as quickly as possible. You don't have much time to dwell on the emotional, the obvious emotional aspects of what's in front of you.
The investigation would be overseen by Detective Chief Superintendent Hamish Campbell.
My initial thoughts were like many others. It was certainly bizarre and rare. And in ordinary circumstances, the discovery of a naked person inside a locked bag in their own premises almost invariably would result in immediate identification of murder. When you're looking at homicide, you have to have some theories to it, and in this case, Gareth's death had only 3 options primarily. Either his death was a single event by himself and no one else involved. The second scenario was that his death was the result of another person or persons involved in him being placed in that bag. And the third possibility is again that other person or persons were involved and it was murder, and that Gareth was therefore deliberately killed and placed in the bag.
The forensics teams had to follow a strict process to ensure any clues that could solve the mystery weren't missed.
The principles that are followed are control, preserve, record, recover. So you get control of the crime scene, you preserve the evidence, make sure it's not interfered with in any way. Then try and establish who is inside the bag, what condition the body is in, and gradually start working towards what is the evidence that's available that might explain how this body got in the bag and how they died. If you look at this crime scene, even as a specialist who attends the scene, it's very likely that you will never have encountered anything like this before. If you then link that to Gareth's background and all the issues that might bring someone who is employed by GCHQ and currently working with MI6, it brings an even more extraordinary dimension to it.
Whilst forensic evidence was being collected, the content of Gareth's flat had already been leaked to the press, and the mystery was deepening. £20,000 worth of women's clothes were found, along with wigs, mobile phones, one restored to factory settings, one with a search history that included bondage sites. The mixture of spying and sex quickly reduced Gareth's lifestyle to a perverse, headline-grabbing version of the truth. The public was fascinated by the case, and television news bulletins were all too happy to broadcast the salacious details of his death.
He'd visited bondage websites, gone to gay bars and bought tickets to drag shows. Police have revealed new details about the intensely private life of MI6 spy Gareth Williams, who was found dead in his London flat in August.
Of course, he had a flat. He had tens of thousands of pounds of women's clothing in this flat. He was interested in women's fashion. He'd been portrayed as a cross-dresser, which there was no evidence that he was. And so what? You know, that was Gareth, and he should be allowed that space to be who he was, not be portrayed as some kind of geek, cross-dresser, kind of demi-spy. That simply doesn't represent him as an individual.
This grisly discovery quickly moved from a standard welfare check to an international headline-grabbing story. A story that involved a dead spy, locked naked in a duffel bag, whose name was already being smeared in the press. Rumours started to circulate that shadowy forces were involved.
And maybe he was the first casualty of what I called a new Cold War with Russia.
He didn't deserve to die in the course of his duty. He certainly didn't deserve to be rubbished and to be smeared in a way that subsequently happened.
It was murder, and it was murder by people who knew exactly how to do it without leaving a trace.
August 2010. Police had been called to an address in Pimlico, West London. It's a straightforward welfare check on a 31-year-old male. But this was no ordinary man. This was a brilliant codebreaker, part of the elite spy network responsible for preventing atrocities, espionage, and terrorism. Gareth Williams' body was found naked, decomposing, and in a bag padlocked from the outside. With very little evidence to go on, the case was getting more complex by the second. To have any hope of unraveling this extraordinary mystery, investigators needed to build a profile of Gareth. The first clue came from his childhood in rural Wales.
He loved the problem, he loved solving it, especially if it was a sort of problem, anything to do with computing or anything in the digital world. To give you an example, I was asked to write a programme which would deal with staff absences in the school, but I was stuck on one thing, I couldn't get it to work. And I said, Gareth, have a look at that for me. And he got hold of it and he had a look and he went through it and he said, in Welsh, he said, Mr. Thomas, this is inelegant. And so he had to look at it and he wrote a little routine that dealt with it supremely. That was the kind of thing he loved. He wasn't a social child, if you understand what I mean. I'm not aware that he had any friends as such. He didn't have any friends in the sense that he had a best friend or that he had somebody he went out with. He was just totally on his own and the computer was his friend. It's that simple. When he was separated from the computer and was asked to go out, quite often I've seen him sort of just walking up and down outside the computer room waiting to be let in like a lost sheep. He was definitely happier when he was sitting in front of a computer, there's no doubt about it.
Although not medically trained and going on his own interactions with Gareth, Nigel believes he may have been on the autistic spectrum.
What I know of autism, and I think that Gareth was slightly on the autistic spectrum, is that it is difficult to interact with other people. It's difficult to understand what the emotions, it's difficult to know what to do in a certain situation. I know that it's difficult for people with autism to have relationships because they have to renew the relationship every time they meet that person. It's a very, very difficult thing to say.
By the time Gareth had graduated from university and started a second degree at Cambridge, his talents had been noticed by the security services and a job was offered at GCHQ. His work involved developing software, analysing patterns of communication, and cracking terrorist activities. He was surrounded by like-minded people, fitted in very well, and excelled at his work.
You need extremely brave people. You need people who can drink 2 bottles of wine at lunch and walk home. But you also need people with completely different skill sets. And as the world digitizes itself, those people who really understand what it all means and how to make it work, they are the jewels in the crown. The computer people are the beating heart of GCHQ, physically located at the center of the donut.
By 2010, Gareth had been seconded to MI6, the elite section of the Secret Intelligence Service, and a very different working environment. The mathematicians and coders had been replaced by elite spies who risked their lives on a daily basis.
MI6 would always, fairly or unfairly, categorize people who worked in GCHQ as typically very introverted, certainly not very sociable, not comfortable in large groups, certainly not outgoing personality types. By contrast, in MI6, the organization is looking very much for gregarious type individuals, people who can hold their own in social situations and indeed can bend with the wind according to the situation they're in.
By all accounts, Gareth's ability to interpret code was extraordinary. But if, as some have suggested, he may have been neurodivergent, this new world of espionage he now found himself in could have been extremely challenging.
A neurodivergent person is a person that what we would traditionally call on the spectrum, possibly autistic. That would have impacted him on his everyday life. His sense of the world, the people around him, his work, his challenges would have been very different to yours or mine. Really, to become a spy, you literally need to be able to read the room. You need to be able to change tact very quickly. And for somebody that is neurodivergent and is used to working with computers, numbers, patterns, that's a very different skill set, and perhaps would have been a lot more challenging that Gareth may have anticipated himself.
Just weeks after starting at MI6, Gareth requested a transfer back to GCHQ in Cheltenham. At the same time, something dangerous was happening in Britain. Money was pouring in from Russia, with a super-rich elite community arriving, keen to hide their wealth and escape the tyranny of the Kremlin, a tyranny that simply moved to London with them.
At the time, in 2010, we had a new coalition government of which I was a part. David Cameron and George Osborne, who were the main protagonists in that government, were keen to improve relations with Russia. George Osborne was keen to attract Russian money into London, which he saw as advantageous to the city.
To attract wealthy foreign investors to the country, the government had launched the so-called Golden Visa Scheme. Applicants had to provide a minimum investment of £2 million in exchange for the right to live in Britain.
We saw an increase in Russian money coming into London belonging to Russian oligarchs. What followed the money were individuals and organizations of fairly dubious character.
And as a consequence of that, a blind eye, in my view, was turned to a range of assassinations which took place, largely of Russian nationals, in London, on the basis that it was inconvenient to draw attention to that and to find the Russian state guilty of assassinations. It's also worth bearing in mind in 2006, Vladimir Putin enabled a new law to be adopted in Russia, which gave license, authority for assassinations to take place abroad if there were assassinations of people who were harmful to the Russian state.
Could Gareth's death be linked to Russia? Over a 10-year period, 14 people with connections to Russia, many of them former spies, died in suspicious circumstances on British soil.
You've got Alexander Perelnichny, who blew the whistle on massive Kremlin fraud. He dropped dead while he was out jogging.
Mr. Perelnichny was not just another man out jogging. He was a whistleblower who was instrumental in trying to expose a Russian scandal that stretches around the world.
You've got Matthew Puncher, who helped pin Litvinenko's poisoning on Putin. He was stabbed to death with 2 knives. Litvinenko himself, who defected from the Russian security services, who was poisoned with radioactive polonium in his tea. Boris Berezovsky, who financed international opposition to Putin. He was found hanging from a shower rail in his home.
Officially, Thames Valley Police are treating the death as unexplained, but there is no shortage of conspiracy theories surrounding it. But a close family friend told Sky News he was not a man who would take his own life.
You've got Alex Chapman, revealed sex secrets of his Russian spy wife, Anna, found dead from massive drugs overdose. You've got Scott Young, who interfered in Russian finance, not to Putin's liking, who allegedly committed suicide by throwing himself out of a window and found himself impaled on railings.
Did he fall or was he pushed? He's one of half a dozen apparently healthy British men, associates of rich Russian exiles, to die here.
The list is really quite long, and what it demonstrates, I think, is that over the years, the police in this country have been quite happy to conclude suicide in the most unlikely circumstances.
The tactic of Russia of late, certainly within the last 10 plus years, has very deliberately been to take a far more brutish approach to espionage. It's, in many cases, not espionage as we know it. It is crass direct action, assassinations or attacks or sabotage or whatever, and that is a deliberate tactic driven from the very top by Putin to send messages to the Russian populace, and that message being loud and clear that, look, if you do similar, this is what will happen to you. So it's all about Putin controlling what he perceives to be his Russian empire. My experience of operating in MI6 was a new world, a far more complex world, far more dangerous. As a spy, being in London, it felt as hostile as anywhere else in the world because of the activities that were taking place there.
The bottom line is that we dropped our guard against Putin's Russia. We dropped our guard, and that is a cause of huge national shame, and it should be, rightly so. Please don't forget, where does Putin come from? He comes from the KGB. And it was blindingly obvious that somebody like Putin as president would be big, big trouble in intelligence and security terms for this country.
Was Gareth Williams discovering some uncomfortable truths behind Russia's influence in Britain?
Maybe that is what Gareth Williams was charged to find out. What were they really trying to do in the United Kingdom? What were they really after? What did it really tell us about what was going on in the Kremlin? And maybe, he was the first casualty of what I called a new Cold War with Russia.
Putin puts a high value on counterintelligence and a low value on those that get in his way. How likely is it that Gareth would become a target for assassination?
Assassinations conducted either by a hostile intelligence agency or even by terror cells, they do take a lot of planning, a lot of forethought. This is speculation, but if Gareth had stumbled across something that potentially compromise what we would categorize as a hostile intelligence organization, such as Russia's SVR or FSB, GRU, it is conceivable that he would have been assassinated purely to shut him up. That is possible, but it would have had to have been an extraordinary potential breach for Russia to have done something like that, would be my assessment.
Whatever secrets he may have uncovered, just months later, Gareth would be dead, locked in a duffel bag.
This was murder, and literally murder most foul.
MI6 operative Gareth Williams' body discovered naked in a holdall in 2010. The obvious cause of death had to be murder, but the police were struggling to find any solid evidence to close the case. As a result, an inquest was opened to explore all the circumstances leading up to the discovery of his body and work out how he had died. The first question the inquest asked was, could Gareth actually have been able to get in the bag and lock it himself? Peter Faulding was one of 2 experts tasked to explore every potential way of getting into the bag and what the forensic fallout might be.
Gareth was slightly taller than me, and you've got to get your shoulders. I say you've got to stand in the bath, you've got to lift yourself over, and you have to pull the bag right the way round. And I practice this time and time again, where your head has got to go first into the bag before you do it. It's very, very difficult. And there's lots of manoeuvring just to get into this bag. It's very hot already. But if you look at my feet now, my feet are all over the bath. It's a very hot environment that day. The heating was turned up, and his body would have been perspiring, but there was no trace at all anywhere of his in this bath or around the bath.
When I visited the flat, the information I was given, there was various traces left around the flat. There was none around the bath, there was none on the padlock, none on the zipper, none on the shower screen relating to Gareth Williams himself. It was very clear that Gareth did not do this himself. It would be an absolute impossibility unless you're wearing forensic gloves and a forensic suit. Gareth Williams was naked, and he would have left traces of sweat and all sorts of marks everywhere within that bathroom.
Gareth Williams could have gone into the bag, he could have zipped it closed, but you cannot do it without actually leaving a trace, and that is what this is about. It's DNA and fingerprint evidence. You've got to place your hands on the bath, you've got to touch the lock, the zip, and there was none of that of Gareth's found anywhere near the area. The other experts agreed with me. They had a yoga expert bending himself into the bag, and I believe their conclusion was the same as mine.
How could that possibly happen? Did this point unequivocally to foul play? For some, the lack of proof did not necessarily equal murder.
The absence of fingerprints in itself isn't proof of anything. It's just the absence of fingerprints. And I always wonder what process is occurring where you think that there has to be fingerprints. You can go to any crime scene where people live and where one of those persons in the house has been murdered, and you won't necessarily find their fingerprints. And we know they lived there. I've had much experience with that as well. So it's in itself is not going to make a case one way or another as to how to determine this crime scene.
There are situations, particularly with DNA and fingerprints, where you simply don't find them where you expect them. It's very difficult to predict. Let's take DNA. DNA is perhaps more easy to explain it. You might think if you pick something up that you will always find your DNA on it. You won't always find your DNA on it. You might think if you pick something up you will always find a fingerprint. You will not always find a fingerprint. So my take on it is that every contact does not leave a trace. To go down that way of thinking is a distraction in a case where there is other important information available.
The inquest was shown videos of the inside of Gareth's flat. Such was the public's interest in the story. These clips were published online by a reputable newspaper. The inquest now focused on why Gareth might have put himself in the holdall.
Claustrophilia is the love of enclosed spaces. Sometimes it has a sexual element to it, whereby people that find themselves in confined spaces get sexually aroused. Sometimes, in fact, they need to be very constrained in terms of their space to feel that they can reach sexual release.
Every year we get a number of cases where people have accidentally killed themselves while engaging in some kind of autoerotic activity. And we know that many times they didn't really mean to harm themselves. But this seemed a sort of slightly strange because of the details of it, really. You know, why bother to get into the bag in the bath? There are some really odd aspects about this.
At the inquest, Gareth's sister insisted that he was meticulous about assessing risk. There was no way he would have put himself in danger of suffocation without a backup plan.
If this was something to do with erotic auto-asphyxiation, it seems very unlikely to me that he would have put himself in such a precarious situation that he didn't have an escape route from the inside.
Because of his professional training, because of his skill set, Gareth Williams understood about risk. And if this had been a mad autoerotic adventure, he would have taken a penknife or something like that with him as he got into the bag. None of that was there.
Gareth's flat was meticulously clean. However, forensics found his semen on the bathroom floor, likely to have been left there shortly before his death. Did that mean that any sex act had actually concluded before getting in the bag?
If it's a solo sexual game, if it is erotic asphyxiation, the release and therefore the semen would be found inside the bag, most certainly not outside the bag.
It seemed there were multiple arguments against the solo sex act theory, but they were far from conclusive.
The coroner also said he wouldn't have got in the bag of his own because he was risk averse. I don't accept that either, because I think risk is often associated with sexual excitement. When we talk about autoerotic deaths, these are extremely unusual things. Generally, you need to be aware that the range of things that can excite people sexually is enormous. It's kaleidoscopic. Autoerotic events are not necessarily things that lead to ejaculation. They are just things that give an intense feeling of sexual excitement.
But how did his alleged sexual fantasies fit in with his high-pressure role at the most secretive workplace in Britain?
His whole life was about not being able to share with his close group of family and friends what he really did. Control, control, control. It may have been that in his personal life, what he really craved was having the ability to be completely out of control, in a way to balance his inner world with his outer world, his external life with his inner truth. So something about being confined spaces that made him feel that he could relax into it because you've got nowhere else to go. You're safe.
The inquest had heard that it would have been possible for Gareth to get in the bag on his own, although there were conflicting arguments about fingerprints and DNA evidence. It was also possible that he had a sexual or other motivation for getting in the bag. But those close to Gareth said he would always have had a safety backup plan where risk was involved, and this behavior was entirely out of character. But then a witness came forward with some startling new evidence.
In a statement read out at today's inquest, his landlady described one night back in 2007 when she and her husband heard a cry for help at 1:30 in the morning. Jennifer and Brian Elliott found him dressed just in shorts, lying on his back with both hands tied to his bedposts.
MI6 spy Gareth Williams was found dead in a bag, locked from the outside. Mysteriously, there were no fingerprints on the scene, baffling investigators. The inquest into his death had become focused on two main areas. Was it somehow linked to his job with the Secret Service? Or was it a sex act gone wrong? The sex game theory would suggest Gareth had a fetish for erotic asphyxiation, an idea which was roundly dismissed by close friends and family. But then, a witness came forward with an extraordinary story.
He was, by all accounts, a polite and friendly tenant, occupying the annex of this house. In a statement read out at today's inquest, his landlady described one night back in 2007 when she and her husband heard a cry for help at 1:30 in the morning. Jennifer and Brian Elliott found him dressed just in shorts, lying on his back, with both hands tied to his bedposts.
Suddenly, the erotic fetish theory had gained pace. But was this witness testimony enough to conclude that Gareth had died accidentally after entering the bag to fulfill his sexual desires?
The assumption that being found tied up and having to call for help to his landlady, escalating into him being found inside a bag locked up, is perhaps parallel to the assumption that if you take weed, you'll end up on heroin. I don't think it necessarily follows that everybody that's into bondage will escalate their fetish into something much more extreme. So again, I'm doubtful that the connection is absolutely clear cut. In terms of him being found in that situation of having to call for help, one thing is true. He knew that he needed to call out for help, and he did. So he had an escape route, embarrassing as it may have been.
Then, another clue emerged about Gareth's sexual interests. He had previously used one of his phones to search for bondage websites. Was this further proof that this was indeed a sex game gone wrong?
The evidence that we used to form the view that this was an autoerotic death was weak. There wasn't a great deal of evidence. The evidence that he was tied to the bed in Cheltenham was quite weak, but when you combine that with the fact that there's no evidence that anyone else was in the flat, and the belief, albeit an extraordinary thing to do, that it could be that he could have got in this bag on his own, then it does start to make sense as a kind of circumstantial explanation of events.
The police could find no evidence of a sexual partner in the flat in the hours leading up to his death, nor was there any hard evidence of his sexuality. But one curious detail came to light when searching for clues: a wardrobe full of women's clothing.
They were all bought by him. There were a considerable sum of money, thousands of pounds spent on women's clothing, but we've never established why he bought it. Some of them were still wrapped, I remember, all wrapped in their tissue and clearly unused. The suggestion that he may have been buying them for friends, well, maybe, but they weren't given away. If he had bought them for friends, they were still in his flat, a considerable amount of them. So one's unsure. He had gone on a fashion course. They may have been purchased as part of that course. I don't know. But is it relevant to his death? Probably not. Because as the coroner identified, well, we all identified, he wasn't dressed in any women's clothing at the time of his death.
It later transpired that Gareth had attended an evening class in dress design and was fascinated by fashion. A friend explained that the wigs were for a fancy dress party they were supposed to be attending together. The sex act theory seemed to be losing momentum, and other clues started pointing to a much more harrowing explanation of events. Gareth's death took place on a warm summer evening in August. So why was the heating turned up to the highest setting? The high temperature in his flat resulted in the fast decomposition of the body, compromising the forensics.
The heating was on. It plainly contributed to the decomposition of the body. Some people have speculated that was put on deliberately. And when a body decomposes, the soft tissues go first, and injuries can be more difficult or even impossible to identify. This was one of the problems with being definitive about the cause of death. They can say that he died of essentially of suffocation, but they can't say, for example, whether he had been punched or attacked or anything like that, because you couldn't see any signs of this on the skin. I wasn't sure what to make of that. It does seem a bit odd, but there's no way I can make any sense of that in a forensic review.
You're making the assumption, of course, that somehow this delay was deliberate, purposeful, and an intention to ensure total decomposition, the heating's up. By whom? That starts to presuppose that someone else in the workplace is involved, and there's simply no evidence for that whatsoever.
But there was another detail in the handling of the case, this time by MI6, that caused concern. It took a week for Gareth to be reported missing by the agency. How was that possible for a working spy?
The coroner, Fiona Wilcox, picked up on the quite surprising delay before MI6 actually discovered Gareth's body in his flat, a delay of over a week.
MI6 officers were summoned to the inquest to explain how this could have happened.
Among 3 intelligence officers who gave evidence anonymously was Witness G, Gareth Williams' line manager at MI6. He was asked to explain why it took a week to report the spy's absence after he had failed to turn up for work and for meetings. With hindsight, he accepted he should have raised the alarm much sooner. They found no link between his work and his death and offered nothing that could take the inquiry forward.
It just wasn't adding up that MI6, who deal with national security at the highest level, would not notice Gareth's absence for so long. He'd been due to attend 3 meetings that week, but no concerns had been raised, and none of the usual protocols for absent staff were followed. It took a phone call from his sister to raise any concern.
The no-show for a week is an odd one. Just simply not turning up, alarm bells should have been ringing to the extent that day one of him not turning up, calls should have been made. There is a series of protocols that are followed through in that instance, so it's very surprising. Nothing happened for a full week unless it was a complete lapse.
Adding further intrigue, there was a significant time lag between the phone call to GCHQ and the subsequent call to the police.
We know that Gareth's sister, Kerry, contacted the security services on the 23rd of August at 11:30 in the morning to express concern that he'd gone missing, apparently. But the police were not told about this matter until 5 hours later, at 4:30.
And what about the phone call itself? Why wouldn't MI6 attend the address, a 5-minute walk from their office? Why call 999?
Emergency service. I wanted to report one of our members of staff who lives and works in London as missing.
This just sounds very odd, though. GCHQ obviously has a hotline that you do not need to call 999, so I do not understand what that phone call was. And if it was an official call from GCHQ to the police, there's better ways of dealing with it than 999. I'm surprised by that level of detail, to be honest.
As criticism of MI6 mounted, a further issue was introduced. 9 memory sticks belonging to Gareth were found at his office. They could have provided important information, but were not handed over to the police, nor their content revealed. Their existence only emerged during the last day of the hearing.
Taking any form of electrical equipment in and out of the likes of MI6 headquarters, that is extremely difficult.
You can't just take memory sticks into MI6 or MI5 or GCHQ. You can't take mobile phone, anything electronic. And the most sophisticated sensors that exist are operative in those places to pick up anything. It was a sacking offence. If Gareth Williams had taken those memory sticks into MI6 and they had been discovered, he would have been dismissed immediately. So the fact that memory sticks were in his locker in MI6 suggests to me that he was authorised to have them there.
This raises questions about what level of work Gareth was involved in. Were these memory sticks sanctioned, or had he smuggled them in for his own personal reasons?
Although if they were deemed suspicious, either by MI6 or GCHQ, then that obviously puts doubt in the fact that they could have been for work purposes. If, therefore, they belong to Gareth on a personal level, then that would beg various questions. Why on earth would he have been stupid enough to bring them into one of the most secure, top-secret buildings on the planet? If he was doing it for covert espionage reasons, In other words, he was looking to nick secrets. That would have been very high risk, but it is possible. If that was the case, he would have intended to have obviously removed them at the first opportunity. But again, if I'd have been Gareth doing something as untoward as that, I'd have taken them in, and then upon leaving work, I'd have taken them out. I would not have left them in situ.
But what kind of secrets or compromising information could have been stored on these memory sticks?
It could have been stuff which was not related in any way to what you were doing, not related to his death in any way, and which was sensitive material which MI6 didn't want to get out. It could have been that. It could have been GCHQ files. It may have been, in that sense, innocent. However, if that's the case, why didn't they declare what was there, at least in terms of generalities? They could have said to the police, we've got 9 memory sticks, they contain sensitive information, but here are the broad topics which are covered.
The disclosure of the memory sticks so late in the hearing left the impression that MI6 were less than eager to help. Indeed, the coroner said it remained a legitimate line of inquiry that the Secret Services were involved in Gareth's death.
The interesting question is why MI6 appear to be so willing to impede a police investigation and prevent the real facts about this matter from coming out. And you have to conclude that there were security reasons why that should be the case.
Gareth's sexual behaviour became the story, not the highly secretive work he was involved in. This way of deflecting public interest away from the truth is familiar territory for the Secret Service.
So it's not inconceivable that Gareth Williams was effectively sacrificed in reputational terms because it was deemed to be necessary for the national interest to be carried out. That's unfortunate, but I mean, there is a history of that sort of thing occurring in our country. Stephen Milligan, the former Conservative MP who was investigating arms to Iraq, who was found dead in a sexually compromising position, wearing suspenders and stockings, and with an orange in his mouth. And of course, that was a story which then became the news, rather than what he was investigating as an MP about dodgy arms deals. There's also questions of how the press found that out. They weren't there in his kitchen, were they? They were told by the police about this in order to generate that story. Then there's Jonathan Moyle, the defence journalist based in Santiago, who was found stuffed into a hotel cupboard in a way that implied some sort of sexual deviancy. But the reality is that Jonathan Moyle had discovered the sale of 50 helicopters at a very sensitive time to Saddam Hussein. Subsequently, the Chilean authorities concluded he'd been murdered, and that was endorsed by a British coroner. I imagine that the family will have been distraught. And then when he is smeared, totally inappropriately and disgracefully, probably by his own employers, then that becomes a matter of deep regret and disgust.
I suspect that what MI6 did not want to say was this was an operational death, that Gareth Williams was doing something that put him in harm's way. He agreed to do it, unfortunately paid for it with his life. But the balance was between our national security and giving her the full story. And the decision was taken that national security should win out. And it has always been like that in this country.
But if the British Secret Service was somehow involved in or covered up Gareth's murder, the ultimate question remains, why did they do it?
I think what Gareth may have stumbled across is the identity of a Russian mole in GCHQ, and that would have caused them to conclude he had to be eliminated.
Gareth Williams was found dead, locked inside a bag, aged 31. His work as an MI6 spy meant the case had become headline news all over the world. But was it murder or self-inflicted? The coroner suspected foul play, but with insufficient evidence, could only give a narrative verdict.
I've always been satisfied that a third party may have been involved in his death, and the coroner has confirmed that in her finding today.
The news headlines were quick to run salacious stories about Gareth's private life. Thousands of column inches were devoted to his interest in bondage and women's clothing. But could it have been that these very secrets were discovered by Russian security forces and used as leverage for blackmail?
50 years ago when I was a student, if you were a homosexual, you could not work for a secret British agency because you laid yourself open to blackmail. Well, there's a very simple answer to that, which is to tell people, for the people to accept that that's fine, that's how you want to live your life, as long as it doesn't get in the way of your professional duties, that's fine. And if you tell them, at a stroke, you remove the blackmail threat. And I don't think getting kicks by tying yourself up in bed would put you in a position where you were being blackmailed.
For MI6 officers, we are briefed about the potential of hostile agencies, particularly the more sophisticated hostile agencies, such as one belonging to the Russians, approaching us as officers and putting something compromising in front of us. The rule of thumb with that, the organisation MI6's attitude was if that happens, if you're approached, look them in the eye and say, publish and be damned. And then come back and be honest with us, MI6. That is the approach taken. Be defiant. Do not allow a hostile agency to get its hooks into you through blackmail.
So I would anticipate that Gareth Williams would have, in fact, been quite open with MI6 about his preferences. However, the Russians may not have known that, and of course the Russians do specialise in compromat when they secure information about someone's personal activities and try to use that as blackmail. It's a technique going back decades, which the Russians are very keen on.
Despite a thorough police investigation and an inquest that had examined all the events leading up to the discovery of his body in forensic detail, his death remained a mystery. Speculation continued that Russian forces were somehow involved, but no definitive link had been found. Then, something extraordinary happened. A former major in the KGB came forward with some startling information.
Boris Gorbachev was someone who was in touch with me, who I think was also fearful for his own position in this country, given the number of suspicious deaths of Russians which had been occurring. And he believes he knows what happened from his contacts, which he still maintains within the Russian state and the Russian security services.
Karpichkov explained that Gareth had been identified as a person of interest to the Russian Secret Service. They were aware of his sexual interests and were trying to blackmail him into working for them.
I think what Gareth may have stumbled across is the identity of a Russian mole in GCHQ, and I believe he would have told his MI6 handlers about that matter, and they would have been fully in the picture. That being the case, the Russians would have concluded, perhaps, that Gareth Williams had to be disposed of in order to protect their source within GCHQ Cheltenham. That would give a reason for his disposal.
But not everyone agreed with this new intel.
That article appears in a newspaper, almost unattributable. There's no further source to it, and it's printed, and then that becomes an alleged truth. And I don't understand that at all. The whole story is fantastic, but it doesn't come with evidence, it doesn't come with witness statements, it doesn't come with any subsequent inquiry from the police or the security services. It's a story which is published just this side of anonymous, faceless certainly. And what does one do with that? Where does that come from? If someone knows that much information, how come it's not then subject to full scrutiny and a resolution?
Talk about speculation. That speculation upon speculation, people like me are always going to be very wary of defector evidence. Defector evidence is very important, but it can be motivated. Some Russian may well have made an approach to Gareth Williams. Gareth Williams immediately went to see his line manager in MI6 and said, "What shall I do?" And it was talked about, probably talked about at the highest level. They said, "Yeah, but go with it. Find out where this is leading. What do they want?" and maybe to see an opportunity for a counterintelligence move against the people who had recruited him, and that their discovery that actually he was spinning them along meant that he had to be killed. And so they killed him, and they killed him in such a way as to ensure that their own fingerprints were nowhere to be found. And it was a professional job. There's no question about it. Inconceivable. It was not a professional job. If you rule out suicide, then it was murder. And it was murder by people who knew exactly how to do it without leaving a trace. I think that's much more plausible than to state the existence of an unknown Russian agent in GCHQ. I think that is very implausible.
If we accept that Gareth may have been killed by his dangerous and secretive work with MI6, why then did it take them so long to find his body?
I think they deliberately kept information about his death secret, didn't look for it, didn't look for the bag, as it were, until they had to.
MI6 operative Gareth Williams had been found dead, locked inside a sports bag in the bathroom of his London flat. 3 years on from his death, and following a police investigation and an inquest, his death remained a mystery. But a former KGB major had recently come forward with a plausible explanation of what had happened to Gareth. It might also explain why MI6 had taken so long to discover his body.
I think the reason was that those at MI6 were aware that Gareth had identified a particular mole in GCHQ, and they wanted time to find that person and deal with them. And had they gone public immediately with knowledge of his death, then that would have alerted that person down in Cheltenham, and they may have scarpered. So I think they deliberately kept information about his death secret, didn't look for it, didn't look for the bag, as it were, until they had to.
MI6 and MI5 and indeed GCHQ will never provide details of operations, current operations that they are involved in. And the decision was taken that national security should win out.
The mystery and debate around Gareth's death has been raging to this very day. With a lack of evidence, but no lack of theories of murder motives and foreign involvement, leading experts are still bitterly divided as to what really happened to the body in the bag.
What do I think happened to Gareth Williams?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, my personal view was it was not homicide, it wasn't murder. I didn't believe the view that a man or women or other men from whichever nation state is alleged, whether it be the Russians or whatever, I didn't subscribe to that at all, that they had come to his premises, clearly not forced entry, gained entry, therefore presumably with permission, and that then they somehow forced him to strip naked, placed him in a bag, and left him there for dead. I've never understood how that could be the case. And I think Gareth Williams' profession, his high intelligence, his constant risk assessment of his role and work in what he did would never have allowed that to happen.
There is no evidence that anyone else was in that flat other than his sister and 2 employees of MI6. So there is no direct evidence of criminality in that flat. If you believe he couldn't get into the bag on his own, then plainly you are compelled to believe that a third party was involved. But that's not the conclusion I reached on the basis of the evidence I reviewed.
What I would find extremely difficult to believe is that, for example, a Russian, highly trained team of assassins decided this was the way they were going to kill him. It's a very clumsy way to kill somebody, and of course there's no guarantees. He could potentially have got out of that bag, somebody could have found him, rescued him. If you're going to do an assassination, the one thing you need to be absolutely clear about is that there's going to be a death at the end of it. And this way of dying, there could have been a better outcome. He could have survived. So my view on his death remains that either this was a sex game that went wrong, or it was related activities such as suicide or an activity that used sex kit that was in situ within his apartment.
I tend to agree with the coroner, Fiona Wilcox, who concluded this was an unlawful killing. That was also the view of the investigating police officer, DCI Jackie Sabia. An escapologist tried, I think, 300 times to lock himself into the bag in the manner in which Gareth Williams was found, and found he couldn't do it. You then have a situation where there were no fingerprints from Gareth Williams found on the bag, on the bath in which the bag was found, on the padlock or anywhere else. Therefore, in my view, for the police to then subsequently 3 years on conclude it wasn't unlawful but some sort of suicide, I'm afraid smacks of a cover-up.
I suspect that what was responsible for his death was the work that he was doing for MI6. I also suspect that work almost certainly involved developing some kind of a technical relationship, personal technical relationship, with a hostile intelligence service. And increasingly, since 2014, I come to believe, that hostile intelligence agency was Russian in origin. And I think that his death was arranged and executed by agents, officers of the Russian government.
He didn't deserve to die in the course of his duty. He certainly didn't deserve to be rubbished and to be smeared in a way that subsequently happened.
It's important to remember that the secretive world of MI6 means we don't know what Gareth was or was not involved in, or what level he was operating at. However, the head of MI6, Sir John Sawers, certainly did. He made a point of attending Gareth's funeral, praising his enormous talent and his valuable contribution to our national security.
Maybe Sir John Sawers' turning up at the funeral is, in a sense, giving him a posthumous medal. The balance of evidence suggests that Gareth Williams should be remembered as a hero who was killed in the course of operations and by enemy action.
Gareth Williams was being smeared constantly as a transvestite cross-dresser by all the reports coming out in various newspapers. Gareth Williams served his country and he should have been honoured. I mean, these people protect our country, they work behind the scenes in the dark, murky world, protecting us, but he should have been seen as a hero.
12 years after the MI6 agent was found dead, there have been calls for a forensic case review.
All the time we are learning more and more about how to examine these old, challenging cases in more innovative ways. So there are lots of reasons why it would be a very good idea, I think, to do a proper review of this case, a forensic review, and see what else could be done. It is terrible. It must be terrible for Gareth's family. It feels like it could well be a miscarriage of justice. There is no conclusion at the moment. The coroner says one thing, as I understand it, and the police are saying another. And it's not a good state of affairs.
In such a public death, Gareth's life was thrown under the microscope, and his true character lost in theories and supposition. It's good to remember who he was and what he meant to those who loved him.
At the inquest, his sister said some beautiful words about Gareth. She said, "In terms of a big brother figure, Gareth was perfect. It is impossible to do justice to Gareth's impressive character without meeting him." The understanding is his family really knew him, and by the sounds of things, really accepted him for who he was, exactly as he was. That's very precious. Should we all be so lucky to be fully accepted by our families?